Hello and welcome to the Gopherwood Lounge. I am Arc Press Senior Editor DJ Butler. Come on in out of the rain. Before we get started, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. Come find us on the website at arc.press and sign up for our mailing list. And on X, you can follow us at arc_press. Today I'm here talking with fiction writer V.N. Ebert. V.N., welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, excited to have you with us. I would love to start by sort of talking about whatever you'd like to share about your biography, leaning into the sort of story of how did I become a writer? How did you decide to become a wordsmith? What were your early models or your early influences? Um, what would you like people to know about you as a young person growing up?
Absolutely. So I'm from the deep South, born and raised. Thought I was going to get out and ended up more or less staying here for most of my life and at this point for the foreseeable future. And so This probably common to a lot of fairly introverted intellectual types who were too well read too early. I thought writing seemed like a good logical next step for me. Was kind of one of those kids who like to read two books at once over the course of a weekend and probably gradually escalated that until eventually I discovered the internet and got a smartphone and my free reading took a severe hit for a little while until I integrated that back into actually reading books again. Uh, and so my influences kind of as a writer come out of to some extent out of the South, but also I don't think we've discussed the title of my book yet. My first and primary release is from Passage Press, which is how we got connected, which is a short story collection called Georgia Buddha, Buddha. Yes, I spelled it correctly. That which so half of that is Georgia, half of that is Buddha. So there's an interest in both Southern literature and in sort of in Eastern metaphysics. My editor described it as Flannery O'Connor, but more masculine, and Lomez at one point kind of described as an unusual melange of the South and the Far East, which I'll stand by that as somebody else's reviews.
Yeah. So Flannery O'Connor, one of my favorites. Beautiful writer, shocking writer. We'll get to Buddha in a minute. Were there other writers that early on you read? By the way, O'Connor is you said your editor picked, so maybe for all I know, you're like I hate Flannery O'Connor, but
Yeah,
like
I wear my influence from Flannery O'Connor, very much on my sleeve,
fantastic.
and have read the Library of America edition of her work. I think I've read through that twice, which is a very good collection. Also includes her letters, which were fun. Little insight into somebody who didn't write really kind of didn't write terribly much, except for the fact that she had lupus and managed to spend 20 years of her life trying desperately not to die from lupus.
Yeah,
Uh, and then also, there's sort of a pulp tradition that I like, the kind of the Raymond Chandler tradition. There's a minimalist element to my prose, not my interviews, where kind of a very sparse, stripped down approach that has an O'Connor influence, but also has a certain element of kind of the commercial pulp writers, not ironically the vast majority of pulp writers who were very prolix, but the ones who have tended to survive down to kind of still have a current readership, which like one metaphor and one punch and get out.
yeah. Um, Shoot, I'm blanking on his name. Jerry co-wrote Moat in God's Eye with Larry Niven. I'm forgetting, but he passed away a couple years ago. Shortly after I met him, actually. But one of his sort of amusing comments was sitting on a panel of writers talking about how to sort of write economically. He said, "What are you talking about? I'm paid by the word."
Yes. Oh, yeah, that from Charles Dickens to the sci-fi hacks
Yeah,
to the pulp
you're right.
writers.
A
Yeah,
lot of those pulps, we gave them a certain incentive and they responded.
they do. Also
Uh,
why they write so much. Not a problem that many of us have today, unfortunately.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So, okay, so that's interesting. I actually don't know Chandler's biography. I associate him with sort of California. Is that a reasonable association? I'm not sure why I'm even making that.
It
Um,
is, and he, if I'm not losing my mind and possibly surreptitious Google to make sure I'm not about to make a total fool of myself over this interview. So he was kind of interesting because he started writing fairly late in life
mm,
commercially because the Depression wiped out his job. He was an oil company executive.
oh, interesting.
And I don't, it was until I think his 30s, maybe it's close to 40. Somebody will look this up and tell me how I got the date wrong, but that's about right. Before he started publishing commercially in a big way, because it was the Depression, it was California, and he needed something to write about. So he kind of inadvertently created the American hard-boiled tradition to make a living,
Yeah,
which good on him.
yeah,
But
good
yeah,
on him.
very California oriented, and I think there's a little bit of a leitmotif in my collections or my various stories that California is the great other kind of the far west that people who
Mhm.
are bunkered down in either a deep south or kind of the deep south abroad view California as kind of the modern, the new, kind of where America ends in the Pacific Ocean and it's promised, but also terribly, terribly far away.
Yeah. That's interesting. This is sort of the image I had of California when I was young, is it was a very exciting place. It was a glamorous place. I didn't know the Central Valley and Bakersfield and, like, the farms and droughts.
Yeah,
You think of, like, Hollywood.
yeah, exactly.
Um, my image has changed now. It's
That's
a
that's
little darker.
That's fair. And I haven't been out in California in well over a decade, and that was the Bay Area. So
Yeah.
kind of very different energy. I'm happen to be rereading or partially reading, partially rereading Steinbeck, who's also very much of kind of the interior farming,
Yeah.
Salinas Valley, kind of California.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so talk to me about this sort of the age of the Buddha half, right? How did you come by how did you come by this? Is this part of your family history or personal exploration, or is this pure aesthetic interest?
So a little both. Lomez a while back did kind of a text interview with me that kind of explored this. So for whoever's read that, this might be redundant for everybody else. It's new information that my family has a little bit of a seeker streak in it that's maybe a little bit unusual given basically where we're all collectively from. But my grandmother, who of all people, as probably the most influential on me as kind of how I turned out this way, was born very poor in East Texas, ended up getting a PhD, taught college, and changed religions a couple of times over the course of her life. And towards the end, kind of when I started to show up, was very into Jungian psychoanalysis, was kind of into kind of the sort of new agey, the very hyper intellectual end of the new agey movement, and so that kind of points also towards sort of Buddhism, Taoism, that kind of I'm going to be honest, turns kind of into a vague melange of different East Asian traditions that all sort of get dropped on our plate as one big Eastern thing. But so that kind of pointed me towards it, kind of towards an interest in it, and then I find religion interesting. I probably say that I convert and sort of fall back away from it every few years. And also just aesthetically, there's something to even just using as a way of structuring the world that I find appealing. And I like the sense of order to kind of the Japanese aesthetic, the kind of stereotypical Japanese aesthetic, but which also has an like I said, has an order to it, has a certain grace, and has that kind of an interest in the minimal, which shows up also in my work.
Interesting. And so do those So the sort of grace and the minimalist aesthetic, but do the sort of do some of those sort of spiritual themes, maybe the illusory nature of material reality, or kind of the eternal return and the attempt to escape, like do themes like that? It's striking that you use the word Buddha in your title. So I wondered to what extent those sort of big spiritual themes might also be in your writing.
So it does. In fact, kind of looking at the table of contents, that I mean, some of them, Floating World is one that actually is kind of a decent intro to the whole collection. And others that kind of are Death Poem, which is kind of inspired by the sort of Zen death poem tradition, but being transposed to a Vietnam veteran. Sky Burial, which takes the Tibetan idea of a sky burial, and also, I mean, use the word transposes, or the phrase transposes to a Southern setting a lot because that's what I end up doing a lot of. But that interest in transience, in a kind of violent understanding of enlightenment that's kind of a fusion of a Southern interest in a kind of violent religiosity, which also is very Flannery O'Connor influenced,
Yeah.
with a Buddhist metaphysics.
No, interesting. Um, and is it tell me about genre of this collection. Um uh, it feels like you're describing it feels like all of the references we're talking about suggest that these are sort of essentially literary short stories. Is that a good way to think about this, or are there other flavors in there?
So it's definitely a literary collection. There's a pulp influence. So I think some of my stories have a little bit of the old New Yorker, two people talking and one of them becoming deeply upset is the main occurrence. And then there are ones where everybody gets shot in the head, and there's not a lot of middle ground between those. Um, but so it's definitely some that have, like I said, sort of a pulp flavor. There are a couple that got labeled as Bonnie and Clyde stories because they're about a male-female crime duo, different ones across the stories, and others that are um, a lot of Southern Gothic in it. Kind of everything is either post World War II, post Vietnam, or post Civil War. Kind of a a commonality of setting, even if it's three different settings, but kind of an interest in kind of a post-war moment. And also kind of a birth of noir in the post-war, so post World War II. Um, so all that to say that it's literary, but with um, at times pulp or other kind of genre influences.
And had you are these previously published? Are you out there on the scene putting out these stories in, magazines or online fora or something, and now they're being collected, or is this really the initial publication of the stories?
So my first publication was actually with Passage, with the first Passage Prize
Mm,
collection. I won the first Passage Prize with the short story Georgia Buddha, which is now the title story of the collection, which is also I claim to be the first fiction from Passage Press. I got published at the same time as someone else, but Inside Story, I had the contract first. So
there you go. Plus, you won the
I'm out there.
prize, so
Exactly, and I won the prize. So Georgia Buddha, the story was published in that anthology. I was in one other anthology from Passage a couple of years ago after the war, which was kind of a collection of just very kind of online
mm,
writers, kind of a weird mix. I think Michael Anton was one who I didn't really knew had any interest in writing fiction. So
mm.
I now share a publisher and share story collection with Michael Anton. Life takes weird turns sometimes. And other than that, mostly online. I think I got published. Sorry, I'm trying to go back because my publishing went from doing online self-publishing, which I'm still doing on my Substack, and kind of accessible via Twitter as well. And I also have a WordPress that has some older stories on it, but isn't being updated as frequently to basically trying to get published in physical hard copy, which is a lovely thing, but also sort of slows down your rate of getting stuff to press. Um, a lot harder for it to be a physical book than to hit submit online.
Yeah.
But so those are the main physical collections right now, and then also some stories, including an in-progress novella that I'm serializing on my Substack.
Yeah, on your Substack. Okay, we'll come back to that. I want to see if there's more you willing to tell us about your youth. So by the way, like Chandler, like I always wanted to be a writer, but I did other things. I went and I had a career in law, and I was 37 when, for various reasons, the time was right, and I started seriously attempting to publish. Uh, how should we imagine you? I mean, did you were you one of those bright young folks who went to got an MFA because you always planned to be a novel writer? Do you have a day job as a librarian somewhere, or running a convenience store? Did you come to writing early or late?
Can I say both? So I tried from early. Did not have basically anybody who's trying to write something at 18, it's going to be terrible, unless you're Keats or a
Yes.
dead British poet with tuberculosis. And kind of entered college. I was not an English major, and I don't have an MFA, but I took two creative writing classes undergrad. One was in my freshman year, and one was in my first senior year because I was one of those people who liked college and sort of refused stubbornly to leave. Um, the first one was a very rigorous program taught by a crusty guy who I'm not going to give too much identifying information about,
Sure.
who I don't want to say his goal in life was to make everyone in the class cry, but who definitely was fond of bringing the hammer down on your belief that you're about to write the great American novel, or at least the great American short story, aged somewhere between 18 and 22, which, in retrospect, fair. He didn't have to be quite so gleeful about it, but so that produced a handful of stories, which are probably somewhere on a hard drive of a laptop I have since disposed of, and I'm probably grateful that no record exists of what I believe I ultimately received a B minus in that class, which was two C pluses, one B minus, and an A participation grade. So at least I made an A on participation grade. And then that kind of knocked the wind out of me. And also just sort of life happened, kind of stuff, yada yada, kind of few years passed. I had the ambition, was still kind of reading everything in sight, but was pursuing other interests, trying to figure out what kind of in college, what am I doing, trying to figure out, okay, what job do I want when I leave college? Because I was smart enough to realize, oh, I'm not about to make a living as a writer. Figured that one out graciously fairly early. Maybe B minus was good for that. And then kind of towards junior or senior year, said, okay, I'll try it again. Took a second creative writing class, which was a kind of structureless, hippy dippy kind of free for all, which was much more encouraging. Had I not taken the first class, would have been a waste of my time, just
Mm,
because you don't necessarily learn anything, but did end up massively overcommitting towards the end. It helps I was taking a very light course load at that point because I was at
yeah.
this point just trying to extend my period of being a blissful, ignorant college student. Uh, and end up writing the first draft of what became um, Georgia Buddha after a series of additional basically 5 years later, ends up becoming George Buddha after some further revisions, as well as a first draft of what became Sky Burial, which is the first thing I put out on my own on my WordPress and is somewhere on my Substack as well, and is now actually the first story in the collection. Kind of a sense of growth as a writer. I looked at it is basically when Georgia Buddha, I found out was getting published. Suddenly, my career ambitions sort of bloomed again. I submitted it.
This
Basically,
is
I
about
saw,
3 years ago, 3, 4 years ago.
yeah, it's 3, 4 years ago now.
Yeah.
Let me think. it is probably going on like, yeah, going on like 3 years, 10-ish months at this point. I think that was in November of 20 2021, 2022. I should know this, but I don't. Uh,
Mm,
so around that point, kind of started looking through, well, okay, what do I have? And I realized I had a first draft of Sky Burial, which was not called Sky Burial, and then actually kind of revised it to kind of basically what my interest had evolved in over those previous years. And I'm the only person in the world who looks at that story and says, okay, I see the two layers of this story right in front of me. And I think I've done a good enough job hiding that connective tissue of what were, in fact, two stories written, or a story written 5-ish years ago, and then a story that was heavily rewritten on top of it. But I end up being fairly happy with it, and like I said, it's now the lead. But so that experience got me kind of back on the train, and has actually ended up being a pretty productive period because so Georgia Buddha gets published, or at least Lomez says, "Hey, you've won. You know, congrats." And I put out Sky Burial. I put out a handful of other stories that end up being incorporated into the collection. And he reached out basically the summer um, after the prize was announced, and I can't remember if the book had been published yet or if it was in production at that point, and said, "Hey, I've got I'm starting a publishing house that and I have 3 slots for new fiction. One of them's yours if you wanted it." And I did not immediately scream yes, 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 but I composed myself and texted back, yes, I would absolutely be interested. When do you need it by? And so that began a very let's just say hectic period of manic productivity to get a collection together under a deadline, which basically turned into what has become 3 pretty productive years. Because
yeah.
so the lesson is sometimes success kind of breeds more, at least gets you willing to go back to typing.
No, for sure. Having a deadline, having a promise of publication, having an audience that's waiting for it. These are, my experience. These are healthy stimuli to get a writer to do the thing.
I agree. It's great to be internally motivated. I certainly am. I'm more than the average person. I suspect everybody who tries to write is, but it's also really nice to have an audience. It's nice to know there's somebody out there who's actually wants to read what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. Are you? Do you? I mean, I infer you're fairly. You and I are talking for the first time, but my sense is from your online presence that you're fairly private, not Thomas Pynchon quite, but do you talk to readers? I mean, I guess maybe they might email you back through your Substack, for example. Do you have a lot of contact with them?
So I am perfectly fine if somebody wants to reach out and discuss something with me.
Hmm,
I am probably not going to preemptively send out a message into the ether to my readers to have a conversation with me. I am a relatively private person with who has of course chosen a public facing um, side job because that's how a certain kind of writer is. I guess I'm one of them. Uh, and I've also said, and I've said this to Lomez at some point, that it would not be, I would not lose my day job if this all came out, but it would make my day job into a long series of conversations that I would prefer not to have
hmm,
to ritualistically go through with everyone. Hi, I'm me. Yes, I do write books. No, you don't want to read them. Please don't read them. I don't want to deal with that. So I'm a really good self-marketer as this all kind of, I'm a big self-promoter. I think Lomas absolutely loves that part about me, my
yeah.
willingness to self-promote. Uh,
Well, let's okay, but let's explore that. That's interesting because I can imagine Flannery O'Connor saying a very similar thing to ladies in church or something, or a priest, and say, like, listen, some of my stories are they have things that might surprise you in them. Uh, you know, um, uh, I don't want reluctance is an assumption. I'm not saying you're reluctant, but why would you warn people away from your writing? What about it? Um, where did that come from?
Yeah, I think some of it is just a sense that my what I write about versus what my day to day is like are very different things. And admittedly, that's partly because, as I said, about half my stories end with violent death. So hopefully that's fictionalized. But yeah, when you write real, extreme stories about extreme people, it maybe raises the question of, well, so VN, what inspired you to write this story? Who were you thinking about when you wrote this story about this person being shot and probably deserving it more than a little bit? Um, but there's also just I have various relationships with people that would be made a little bit more complicated, kind of like Flannery O'Connor's Ladies in Church, and this I think probably accurate enough hypothetical that yeah, it's nice to be able to sort of compartmentalize your life. To here's me discussing this kind of slightly out there or idiosyncratic vision of the world, or which I believe in or half believe in a very Buddhist way,
Mhm.
and also non-committal way. And but also me just kind of going about doing my day job and just kind of lining up all my little ducks in a row in that and having relationships with people who are not necessarily like deeply in the in the literary scene or just have no real interest in this. I think two people in my family know about it mostly because one of them told the other person. So
Oh,
and I
wow.
had a chance not to. So but um yeah, and also I think there's sort of a like, I just don't see my parents would like these stories, and I don't want to deal with having that conversation with them. And I think like Philip Roth probably had some kind of had to overcome that energy at some point, and there's probably it's been a while since I've read Roth, but there's probably a story somewhere about Philip or a Philip Roth novel with a thinly veiled Philip Roth protagonist, because all protagonists in Philip Roth novels are
Or Philip
thinly
Roth.
veiled version of telling his very Jewish mother that, well, mom, I wrote this sex novel. Yes, it is based on my childhood. Please don't kick me out. Something, some variation of that. But
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. So, okay, so I one thing I infer from this story, is, you're still a relatively young guy, it sounds like.
yeah,
Um, and so that's interesting. Like, where would you like your career to go? What are you aiming at? What are you if you look around and say, well, whose writing career would I want? Right? Who do you think of?
that's a really good question. Which is a really good question way to deflect when you don't know the answer to it off the top of your head.
Yes, it is.
That you know, yeah, I'll go back to sort of Flannery O'Connor as somebody who
Mhm.
can write productively, can have if you write something, somebody is willing to publish it, and some readership exists to support the habit, but not necessarily expecting to quit my day job,
Mhm.
which I guess in her version is living life quietly on a farm with your mother. That's not quite my version, thankfully. I would not do well with either half of that. But something where I can write productively, but still kind of do my own my own life outside of writing.
Yeah. Interesting. There's a Leonard Cohen said in an interview, because I think this was basically his existence until unexpectedly late in life, Hallelujah turned into a mega hit, which is an interesting story. But he said something like, "I have been blessed to be able to write what I want, and make a living at it," which feels to me like that's a good goal, right? If I can be true to
I
my
agree. Yeah,
my muse, my inspiration, not sell out, uh, you know, um, reach an audience, make a little money. That sounds good.
I agree. I am definitely. I think I've said that my most likely realistic aspirational level of success is as a cult writer. I have a very particular style, which I suspect not everyone is going to look at and be totally in love with.
Mm,
I'm not a lush writer.
mm,
I'm not somebody like there's a great tradition of I think of it as British novels, and that's not necessarily totally accurate, but kind of turn of the century, kind of like a mom novel, or actually kind of outside of that tradition, but I think of it too, Under the Volcano, Malcolm Lowry, kind of the great kind of overwriting tradition of kind of it completely sucks you in into a very brilliantly illuminated world. That is probably not me. I've described my writing as much more of as a caricature rather than an oil painting or as a brush stroke painting, which again, searching around for an East Asian metaphor because I apparently obligated to do that now that this is my brand, apparently. Um, my self-created brand. So there are certainly going to be people who I think respond to that, and I've really been pleased and more than a little surprised to have people who have even kind of at this point responded very positively and said, "Wow, we really liked this." I can also feel pretty strongly that there are people who are going to be like, "This is just not what we're into," and also just kind of what my set of interests are. I'm writing stories that are for the most part set between 60 and 160 years ago. There's a little bit of an out of time quality to it, and kind of a Southern Gothic tradition, which is not a museum piece because I refuse to believe it's a museum piece, but I can
mm.
imagine somebody coming up and saying, "Well, you're pretending it's 1970 and this is all still recent living memory." And I'll say the South has a long memory, and that will be the end of my discussion on that with this imaginary critic who exists in my head. But
Yeah. That's a nice metaphor, the sort of, some Asian styles of calligraphy that imply as much of the letter as they actually put on the paper. Um, something more at the Hemingway or Elmore Leonard sort of end of the
yes,
spectrum.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So this is interesting, setting stories in the past is, um, so, I don't know what your politics are. I did read an essay published by you in your Substack. I read it today, recently published, talking about the uh, the uh,
It was the embassy.
Bader Meinhof, right? So
I'm
that's
sorry.
the left wing radicals post World War II. Um, I mean, is your interest in the past, is that connect to at all a political sense, a sense that, or a cultural sense that we've lost something, and then there were important things in the past we ought to try to remember or reconnect with?
Sure, I'll say yes to that, and then I'll elaborate on that and possibly go very wide of your question and trying to answer it. So I'm associated with Passage, so I'm a man of the right, much more than I am a man of the left. I think somebody reading my work, my fiction, will probably come to the conclusion that I'm probably not a left winger, and then have a little bit of difficulty figuring out why my fiction seems like something a right of center author would do. I think my interests are much more. It's a more masculine fiction. It's a fiction that is more of an ideas oriented. It's not necessarily interested in kind of relitigating kind of contemporary MFA lit, and that is willing to take people who have very strong views that I don't necessarily approve of, but that who still have humanity and are still kind of have dignity and have something of value to say, which I guess as someone living in the South, kind of circa 2025, who is very kind of interested in the history of the South, is kind of the most measured take one can have. That it's a region with a very particular history, but one that is not to be completely written off as irredeemable. So I guess that would be the political element of it. And then or kind of my personal politics that are influenced by where I'm from, but also just kind of intellectually. For a long time, instead of thinking I was going to be a writer, I thought I was going to be a historian before I found out what the academic job market was, and I was particularly I really bounced between different totally non-viable career
Yes.
paths.
Let's say it's about as bad as fiction.
And it might even be worse at this point, because even if you succeed, you don't make any money. And so I've always been very much a history person. I've always just kind of found it inherently interesting. I remember looking at atlases as a kid and just kind of wondering, well, why are those countries there? And and I guess people who are like into physics would look at the sun and be like, why is this big ball of fire in the sky? And that would lead to something. But for me, it was looking at an atlas. And so I was interested in ideas. I was kind of interested in kind of the total idea, kind of if I had gone down the PhD route, I would have been trying to write on sort of 20th century mass movements, kind of the 20th century is kind of the great age of the totalitarian idea and of the mass society and kind of everything good and bad that comes from living and thinking and acting on a scale that prior to basically railroads, radio, television, you just can't really do. Um, and kind of living in the world that is shaped by that that era and kind of the many often quite bad ideas that we tried and killed a lot of people and then got put back in a drawer. So, so a little both of both. I think being in the South, there's an interest in the history of the South. I think we in like New England have kind of that same kind of we go in different directions on it, but have a very strong regionalistic sense of history and of being shaped by a shared history that is partly shared with the wider country, but is also very kind of distinctively shaped and in some ways very different than kind of the broader national mythology or national history and national mythology. The two are related.
Yeah. It's interesting. Um my sense is that that's actually the the possession of a very regional, even a very local identity is much more common than we realize in America. I think the South is maybe associated with that and has done maybe a better job than some areas hanging on, right? But the national mass media culture is still really quite recent.
That's
Uh,
true.
and there still are real regional differences if you're, in, northern Minnesota versus in Maine versus in small town southern Utah or whatever, Um, I I I forget who wrote this, but some music critic said about Bob Dylan, this was the essence of his music, is that it was set in the old weird America, the
Oh yeah,
pre-modern.
yeah, I've heard basically that, and I tend to agree with it. The kind of fondness for kind of like the carnival America, kind of a freak
Mhm.
show America,
Yes.
that kind of um, it's hard to exactly place when exactly this is meant to have actually happened, but that we have some sort of vague collective sense was at what one point what the country was outside of New York, outside Boston,
You
and
know,
not entirely sure quite actually like where it landed. But no,
you know.
I think that's true. And you're gonna undermine my whole my whole thematic existence as a writer. So, but,
No, no, no. I think it's great that you be a bard of your region and your people, right? That's what we should do.
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I mean, arguably, that homogenized America really is born in the imaginations of the Madison Avenue advertising firms, and what we have now is really slick, right? National chains and iPhones and fast transit, but there's this lingering suspicion that I think this is part of the appeal of Dylan's music is that um, we made a bad trade. that
Yeah, but no, yeah, I
we
get that.
lost some stuff, our souls maybe.
No, I definitely see that, and ironically, one of my stories involves a traveling carnival, so that
Well, fun.
yeah, fun. So I definitely see that understanding. And there's probably some truth, or there's truth to it. I think also maybe to defend my little regional interest, I think in the South there's a because the old days are also the battle days, just because basically we're a part of a country where indoor plumbing comes last to the kind of fewest people for the longest time.
Yeah.
And kind of just the sort of hard rural poverty is just a reality of life for more people out of who lives here than yeah, it's just it's a different story than kind of a prosperous agrarian Middle West. So
Mhm.
in some ways, in this kind of the whole, there's something called the New South. Like there's a much more kind of extreme argument of, well, okay, so what does it mean to change? Because in some ways we're so very wedded to a very powerful local tradition that's also enmeshed in a way of living that yeah, certainly. There's some very pragmatic material and yeah, good reasons to try and move away from, as somebody who now lives in one of the larger cities in the Southeast and frankly does not necessarily love living in one of the larger cities in the Southeast. We're kind of like, I'm
Yeah.
kind of living both ends of that. Like, well, on one hand, it definitely beats the conditions that even my parents were born into, but also there's some there's some downsides here, and it's I think the balancing act becomes um particularly particularly acute for kind of this sort of part of the country.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. Um, well, we should talk about some of your other present and future literary endeavors. So we've mentioned your Substack. Tell us about your Substack. You've got a novella that you are serializing. You've got nonfiction essays. You got short stories. Um, what else? Why are you writing on a Substack, and where can people find it, and what should they know about it?
Absolutely. So I'll start with where it is. It's at VN Ebert Writes. For some reason, VN Ebert has been taken by some just horrible human being who's completely stepping on my ability to market myself. So basically, I needed something to be a little bit more regular than basically sending off to either online or physical publications, partly because I have apparently incredibly little patience to deal with it and like the sense of total control, which I then surrender when I try and actually put it in somebody else's hand and then become I'm very open to my editor's suggestions. But until that point, until it gets there, I'm like, no, this is mine. And also, I need to send it out immediately right now because it's good right now. And if I wait a week, it will no longer be good. And that is irrational, but I think many writers can probably feel that have a similar feeling at some point. So partly just a good avenue to be able kind of more consistently release some stuff, especially it is mostly fiction. I have one nonfiction essay up there. I keep saying I'm going to start doing more essay, more occasional pieces. I actually will have something in a major magazine next month. So that'll be the first time I'm in kind of a national with just a little diary entry. That'll just kind of be a slice of life piece. So looking forward to that.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So
Is it under the name
uh,
Ian Ebert?
under V and Ebert. So
Okay, so can you tell us what magazine? So people.
so it'll be the Spectator World.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah. So I'm looking real forward to that. That'll be fun. Probably do a little celebration for like, yay, we made it. And so in between kind of stuff like that, which, super fun, but hard to figure out, the frequency of that kind of thing. Be able to release on that. Also on Twitter at VNEbert1. Again, that other VNEbert has made my life much harder than it needs to be. But so for what's actually out there, so there's some short stories, including Sky Burial, which I mentioned earlier, which is the first story in this collection. So that one's free, and for I think all the rest in the collection are just in the collection at this point, or in an anthology from Passage Press, which I think sold out its printing and is no longer readily available. So this one's cheaper than finding it on the secondary market and has more. Uh, so working on serializing a novella, which actually the first draft of it was written for Georgia Buddha, and then they said, "VN, this is way too long and cumbersome and doesn't fit the rest of the stories because it's 7 times longer than the longest story in your collection," which was true. That it meant that the collection was a little over 200 pages instead of pushing 300 pages. Still slightly annoys me because our little pettinesses are what keep us going in life. And, so that is being revised and published at about a rate of once every 2 weeks. And we'll probably be putting out some more stories that basically I wrote the equivalent of a second collection of stories. And so I'm trying to
That's fantastic.
put those kind of gradually putting those out there. And I am working on, or I should say, I have a first draft of a novel that has been sent to Passage and are kind of in a discussion to have a discussion about that maybe being released down the line when we kind of get through the editing process of that. So I don't really have a good timeline for that, but hopefully Passage will, in fact, publish it. And hopefully that will be in less than 5 years. So I'm not promising myself any more than that. Um, it, so
Can you tell us anything about the novel? Whatever you're interested in telling us.
sure, absolutely. So it's the current title, and all these things might be totally different by the time this actually gets released. It might in fact be a different genre, or some others are very strange. Who knows what happens in post-production? Titled Boll Weevil, set in the Deep South shortly after World War II. So returning to a theme that comes up a lot with me. Following a possibly psychotic sheriff as he navigates several different illegal schemes and comes up against a new arrival in a county that makes his life much harder than it would be. I described it as Jim Thompson's Population 1280 meet Zen and VR motorcycle maintenance. So if that's a good enough tagline, and hopefully some other people besides my editor and the people at Passage will have a chance to see in print in the nearest future.
Yeah, fantastic. Good luck. I feel confident that we'll see it and that we'll see it in a timely way.
Thank you.
Um, well, look, this has been really interesting, VN. What have we not talked about that we should have touched on? What have I not asked you about that you'd like to tell readers or whoever might watch this?
Give me 1 second to try and come up with something. Um, well, the collection is available from Passage Press and Amazon. I think Passage prefers you buy it directly from them.
For sure.
And um, all readers are welcome. I think you'll like it. And for people who are listening to this and who are interested in writing, read a lot, write a lot. During COVID, I wrote the first volume of what would have been like a 7 volume, 1 million word series, which sometime after COVID, I looked back at and realized, oh, wow, this is horrible. But it was Harry Crews who said that a writer has to write 1 million words, 1 million bad words to finally get to the good ones. And there's some truth to that.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, VN, thank you very much. Really appreciate you joining us. I think that's terrific advice. And for those of our viewers who are watching, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time. Remember, the humans win in the end.